Good evening. Hello, how are you? And this is supposed to be on. Is it on? Yes. Thank you. Couldn't tell. That's nice to get a personal greeting like that. I am Barbara Ballard, one of the associate directors here at the Dole Institute of Politics. And again, we welcome you to Politics, Pop Culture, and Polling with Pat Cadell. You know, there's lots of things we can tell you about Pat Cadell, and I'll kind of run through some of the notes that we have. But first of all, we're just honored to have him with us today, and he did one of our study groups, the study group, this afternoon. And I really would like to thank our fellow Scott Burnett. Scott, would you stand, please, so people know he's here, for bringing our guest to us.
Hey, anything for you, Scott?
Wanted to do that. So let's just look at some of the other programs we may have this evening, because I'm sure you have read about some that's coming in the future. And we just want to remind you, our real big one, May 3rd. It's the 2009 Dole Lecture, and it's entitled Unlimited Partners with Senators Bob and Elizabeth Dole. Now that, I believe, is going to be truly unusual and exciting. And so if you want your ticket, you know, it's at the Lead Center. And for our students, you can actually get them with your KUIDs at the SUA box office in the Kansas Union. And as you know, we have one more session left of the study group. If you haven't had the opportunity to come and you'd like to get in at least on something that you missed, it's Obama's first 100 days, and it's our final study group of the semester, and it's on Tuesdays. The last one is April 28th from 4 to 5:30 p.m. And it's with our fellow Scott Burnett and our director, Bill Lacy. And their last one will be Tim Eunice, who was the advance person for Thompson in 08, and Stephen Jakes, who was the lead advance for Obama 08 to analyze the first months of the Obama administration. And Stephen Jakes also was a fellow here, and then he also spent communications and doing programming for a whole year as well. So we're very pleased to welcome him back for next week. Pat Cadell has a talent for getting almost every aspect of United States politics. His role includes strategist, pollster, campaign advisor, commentator, television show writer, and producer. Now just think, if you bring somebody like that to your campaign, you have everything. You could probably hire 2 or 3 other people and decide you didn't need him because he could do all of that. Okay, he's a native of South Carolina, and he spent most of his professional career analyzing the political scene across the country. And some of his most notable efforts have been working as a strategist in several national campaigns, including the Democratic presidential candidates George McGovern in 1972, Jimmy Carter 76 and 1980, and Joe Biden in 1988. In addition to serving on President Carter's 2 national campaigns, he also took on the role of key advisor. He was his strategist and his public opinion poster during Carter's term in the White House. During his career, Carter has often worked in popular media, movies, and television. He has appeared as a commentator for Fox News Network on such shows as Hardball and The O'Reilly Factor. He's also served as a writer-producer for over 40 episodes of the hit show The West Wing. I think I saw at least 35 of them. And I thoroughly enjoyed them. I mean, you had to get home for West Wing, you know. So when we look at some of his movies, and some of these movies you may or may not have seen, you'll be very surprised. But he was consulting for the films Outbreak in 1995, Air Force One, 1997, and The Running Mates in 2000. And in 1999, he served as executive producer for the film Y2K. He has a wide range of political interests, and it gives him an awful lot of insight into the most pressing issues of the day and public opinion. Before I close with one final note, I would like to recognize we have an additional guest with us this evening. And could I ask Bill Ramju to please stand? And he was involved in the 76 and 80 Carter campaigns as well. Finally, I just want to end with the fact of everything you have heard about Mr. Cadell. He's a legend. He was President Carter's pollster at 26 years old. He's been at this for quite a while. But to start that young had to be potential, but he had to do something ahead of time to be recognized for having the talent that he has. So I would say to you, with everything you've heard, think about when you're running your campaign, or somebody you know is running their campaign, who would be lucky be so lucky as to have someone who could do all of these things, get you elected, and then continue to stay with you to make you look good. May I present to you, with our Director Bill Lacy, our guests this evening, and I hope you will enjoy all they have to say, Pat Cadell and Bill Lacy.
Pat, thanks so much for joining us tonight. I was joking a little bit before Barbara was talking about different ages, that I was in college as a freshman at age 18 in 1972, and Pat Cadell at age 22 is doing polling for Senator George McGovern's campaign. When did you do your first political poll, and who was it for?
I did my first poll. It's a long, infamous story. I was in Jacksonville, Florida. My dad was in the Coast Guard. We lived there at the time, and I was 17, and I had started. We had to do a math project. I was in a private school, and I hated math, but I liked baseball statistics. I really liked baseball statistics. That was the only thing I knew about math. And so, but I had been involved when I was 16 in a campaign for governor, which failed. My first campaign for a gentleman, mayor of Miami, Robert King High, who was associated with Robert Kennedy. So anyway, that night was the first time that CBS, first network, they ever used precinct analysis to predict elections, to call elections. They weren't exit polls, they were actually using precinct data. And they called Florida there no Republican had won in 100 years, and the Democratic nominee, my candidate, lost. They called Claude Kirk at 7:30 at night, and I sat there in disbelief. So I decided I'd do a math project, thanks to the fact that the Florida legislature was malapportioned, and every county had a senator, so that Miami had one senator, and places like little places had counties, Okaloosa County or some Putnam County, they all had a senator. And so the Supreme Court thought that did not make sense, one man, one vote. And Florida kept having this problem of preserving this. So finally the United States government, the court stepped in and they ordered an election in the spring of 1967 and required they redrew the districts themselves, shifted them all the seats based on one man, one vote. And so they had a special election, and it just happened to coincide at the time I had to do this paper, which was going to be 80% of your grade. And so I decided...
This would have been for high school?
High school. I was a junior in high school. So the idea was I would go and predict... I said, I'll go predict the elections. And I had no idea what I was doing. But so I went down. I was very lucky. I found it fortunate to have the supervisor of elections was one of those rare people in politics who actually believed that everybody should vote and it shouldn't be a great mystery. And he was a formerly retired naval officer. So he set me up, and I did this in a month, building a model of precincts to call with my sample, and then he was nice enough to let me come down to the courthouse. This is the days I had one of those big arm adding machines, the ones you push the buttons and you pull the arm. There were no such things as calculators yet. And he had instructed the people in my precincts, I think there were like 18 of them, to call in as soon as they got the results. And in those days, the election, all the candidates went down to the courthouse to get the results. That's where they gathered, because that's where the results came in. You didn't watch television, they reported them, but it was all there. So all that night I kept calling elections and announcing who had won. Now this was insane, because about half a dozen of these races were decided by less than 51-49. And it's a miracle. This was a gift from God. I got them all right. That is just obviously I had an angel. So this became this huge story in Jacksonville. And the press picked it up, and the newspapers, and the TV, and they were all gathering around this 17-year-old kid to see, because the election went on. It was very close. Republicans were making this big run in Duval County, in Jacksonville area where I was. So anyway, so what happened was the speaker designate, Red Schultz, my mentor, who I was very fortunate. He was one of the citizen politicians who decided to run during this period, and he was in Jacksonville, and he was already designated to be the speaker. In those days, Democrats owned the state, and he was 2 sessions away, he would be speaker. So it was a very powerful, and you only served one term as speaker then. And but he'd had a very close election. His whole problem depended on making sure the Democrats held on the majority. So he called me up. I was at home, and called me up and asked me to whether on a Friday, whether he'd read the story in the paper and wanted to ask if I'd help him do some analysis. And by the way, the project he hired me to do, I never did. But anyway, we met, and he was a very brilliant man and very honest. I was very fortunate. Mentors should be of the quality I had. And he said, so I said to him, if this works so well in predicting elections, I bet it would really work well on polling. So he said, well, how would you go about doing it? So, well, I'll just hire my classmates. So I remember we did the first poll I did in Florida. We had a bunch of special elections, the city and the county, and I started appearing on TV doing the predictions for the city elections, and then we had consolidation, the long story. But the first polls I was doing were like $300. I'd hire a bunch of my classmates on Saturday. We'd go out to our precincts, they'd interview people. We tabulate by hand, add them up and stuff, and that's how it all began. And I went from there to that helped. And so, but he became speaker. Later I was doing all of Florida. I was doing all the state and stuff, and then I went up to Harvard and started working in Ohio and other places. And then in 1971, when I was a junior, I was back in Jacksonville, and a guy named Gary Hart, who I, by the way, worked for in '84 along with Mondale. I helped, as I said at dinner, I'm the only person who to help lose 49 states twice, but for all the good things. And also was there for the new Coke. I have a great many stories, but anyway, Gary Hart met me because I worked in the legislature as an aide to Fred Schultz, and that seemed like a great job in Tallahassee. I was a kid, and everybody, it was fun, and I had no idea what was really happening there, but it was fun, and we had a lot of different things. I got to redistrict the place and all kinds of odds and ends. But anyway. So Sandy D'Alembert, who later became the president of the University of Florida Law School, who was later head of the president of the American Bar Association, he was George McGovern's campaign manager, and I was from McGovern, and because of the war, and he told Gary Hart, and Gary Hart and I met. I was in Jacksonville before school started, flew to Miami, met him, and at the end of our conference, because I explained why I had this theory about alienation and why McGovern might win, which I had no idea what I was saying, and Gary Hart, who knew about as much about polling as, well, I knew a little bit more than he did, but he said, well, we need to have somebody do the sampling for us. Would you be interested? And I was very shy. I said, oh, yeah, I think I would consider that. And the next thing I know, I will go up into Washington to meet Frank Mankiewicz. The next thing I know, I'm doing the polling. I'm back at school, New Hampshire next door, and I'm doing the polling for McGovern. And sure enough, instead of being at the end of the pack, he ends up emerging, and that's everything after that. So I was, I got to be, people thought it was kind of interesting. I was so young, and so I was doing that, and that's what happened.
So you were doing polling for a presidential campaign at age 22.
Well, 21. I started 21. Yeah, 21. I didn't turn 22
well,
in
you
May.
were still...
I turned 22. The reason I know that is in May of we were in the California primary, and I couldn't fly youth fare. There was a thing called youth fare, which you could fly half fare if you waited and you were a kid and they had a lot of room. And on you could do that up to the age of 22, and that's when I couldn't fly youth fare anymore. The campaign had to start paying full fare to me to fly. But so I was 21 when I started.
I
did my senior thesis, which I didn't finish. So you had to substitute. I remember doing I did a 60-page paper the night before the Nebraska primary in Omaha, sitting in my room, calling it in. I already had an office and staff. And that's how I ended up. That and taking a swimming test at Harvard, but that's another story. I almost didn't graduate because I was in California, so I had to do it out there. Hunter Thompson was my coach, and it became a cause celeb in the newspapers about the press because I had to have this. You couldn't graduate in those days from Harvard unless you'd passed swimming tests. I'd forgotten to go take one, and so I did it at the the Wilshire Hyatt pool with Hunter Thompson, with the entire National Press Corps gathered for lunch. Hunter Thompson is my coach, for those of you who know, the good Dr. Gonzo, with a whistle and a Grateful Dead T-shirt, and I nearly drowned. I was laughing so hard swimming. But anyway, Marty, and the reason I got to do that rather than having to go back was that Teddy White who was then the famous Make You the President writer, and Chuck Daly was vice president of Harvard. He was up helping Pete McCloskey in his congressional race after he ran against Nixon, and they got together on the phone. And Teddy White said, "This is stupid. You cannot go back in the middle of the campaign, this critical moment." So they arranged that I could take it. and then Teddy White would observe the fact, and the press. And so Marty Nolan, there's still a place in the Boston Globe, you read I'm sure they must have this on the archive, at the end where he said, memo to Harvard at the end of his daily column, today Pat Cadell successfully passed his swimming test. And that's how I graduated from Harvard. That's one of the better stories.
That's outstanding.
That's my experience, how I got started.
Yeah, the 76 Carter campaign really, in many ways, is a classic. You had a small state Southern Democratic governor. You had an outsider. It was just a totally different kind of campaign. Talk about how you got into that race and what your role was and kind of some of your memories from especially the primary campaign.
Well, it was an amazing, I look back on it, I said once to a couple of years ago to President Carter that he was out in LA for dinner, and I said, you know, it's dawned on me now that I've gotten older that the reason that you allowed those of us who were involved with you in the campaign to be in the campaign is that we were so young, and I had contained all the national experience basically in the campaign, which just goes to show you. And I've been in the McGovern campaign, that was mine, and was that we were the only people who were naive enough, or crazy enough at that age to believe that you could actually elect a peanut farmer, and if former one-term governor out of office from Georgia as president of the United States, accept him. And I said, you didn't have any choice. It was like, but it's funny. But they had courted me in '72, and in fact, when McGovern made his trip in the South, Jimmy Carter specific was McGovern. He invited McGovern to spend the night at the governor's mansion prior to the Democratic convention, and Carter specifically asked that I come with McGovern, and I spent the night. We got there after the rally at the Capitol steps. Carter met with, and McGovern met. McGovern went to bed, and Jimmy Carter and Jody Powell and Carter's oldest son and I sat up in the kitchen until 4 o'clock in the morning because I'd done a thesis on the South and the New South and people like him coming, and the coming of Jimmy Carter really was about what would happen when the Wallace voters went back to being populist Democrats. But anyway, so they had courted me. It was a long thing. In '75, they managed to wrangle me in, and I started. This campaign was beyond improbable. My interest in it was I had very strong feelings about what I talked about alienated voters, particularly after Watergate, Vietnam, and so forth. President Carter spent a year, and Scott Burnett and Bill Robbins, they were there much earlier. They were there at this period when he was coming out to places like this and staying at people's homes and going around. And I realized this man had spent a year going around living with Americans. And he really had a sense that it was not about Washington. So he and I had a certain kind of bonding, I guess, intellectually about the view of this. And we were a very small campaign. I mean, the top of the campaign, there was Hamilton journalist campaign manager. Jody had been his press secretary, Jody Powell, who was here. Jerry Rafshoon did the media. Charlie Curbo was the senior statesman when he showed up. And that was about it. And then Tim Kraft was doing Iowa, Phil Wise was doing Florida. But I mean, at the top of the campaign, there were basically that and Rose and Carter. And I was the only outsider, but I wasn't an outsider. I was a Southerner. It's when I learned I was a Southerner. I understood these people, even though I never really lived in the South. And I had no accent. I was living in Boston. But it was something that I felt. And we were so bad in December. This is how. I mean, I do think there's a lot of similarity in many ways between Carter and Barack Obama in terms of being improbable elections from the beginning on paper. Carter's, however, started with he didn't get to speak at no convention. He had he started in December in the Gallup poll, December '75. Gallup forgot and left him off the list. So their list for the presidential candidates, they forgot Jimmy Carter. It's a hell of a way to open a campaign year, being left off by Gallup because you're so insignificant. And the idea, first of all, it made sense. I mean, he was no Southerner had been nominated since the Civil War. The Civil War still mattered a great deal, and in that, and to find the Democratic Party, and here he was, and he had been one of the great racial progressives. And the thing that people in the party could never understand was his support from black people. So it was an amazing. But the whole idea was he campaigned, and he knew this. This was what he knew. Those first few months, I think, in the primaries, of all the candidates, and I worked with 6 presidential candidates, never had I saw a candidate so attuned with the American people as he was. And remember, those are the days you didn't have huge rallies every time in the press. It was very small. But he was attuned because, and he was talking about, what is he running on? He was running on the fact that he was not from Washington. He would not, if he was elected, he would never tell a lie, which the press went crazy over. They said, you cannot tell the American people that you will not lie to them. And President Carter, all the way through his presidency, could never get over the fact, what do you mean? I'm supposed to sit down from the beginning and you have to tell me I have to lie to the American people? Which he just refused to accept. And I think in his mind, that gets to be a definition of what that is, but never was that intent. And he said, and he also said, I'm going to make the country, I want a country as good and decent and filled with love as are the American people, and as competent and filled with love as the American people are. And right after, and Jesse Jackson once said it best, explained it best, he said, well, all these other people running after Watergate and Vietnam and all these terrible events in America, the assassinations in '68 and so forth, and he said, here comes Jimmy Carter carrying his own, he used to carry his own bag, that was his thing. Talk about love your country, healing America, and he said, all these other people, Scoop Jackson and all of them are talking about Senate Bill 8512, and they did this and that. And he said, he's just speaking to the American people, he just walked into their hearts. Well, it was a little harder than that because in the fall against Jerry Ford, the problem would be, at one point we had a huge lead, but it was all artificial, which I also posted in the story.
About 30 points.
We were 33 points.
Right,
we were 33 points ahead after the Democratic Convention. 33 points. And I did a poll, one of the more important surveys we ever did. My partner and I came up with this, trying to figure out, we knew these numbers weren't real. And so we did a special kind of polling, which was an open, and there was an hour-long interview on the phone, all open-ended questions. Only one had anything to do with how you're going to vote, the beginning and the end of the question. The whole poll was geared to, it's the election's over, Jimmy Carter's president, how will he handle these issues? An economic crisis, a foreign crisis. And we started the interview, we were done in batches of 100. And we started up, we were 60-30 ahead. And 60%, 30%, first several hundred batches several of 100 each. And we went through, and people started saying, I don't know what he would do. And people kept going on in the survey, and they said, military stuff said, oh my God, I don't think he has a clue. And at the end of the survey, we asked people how they would vote again, and it was 51-48. And that is, from that moment on, and I couldn't get, no one wanted to believe it, but that was the story of what would happen in the general election was the challenge of a risk of somebody, remember, who no one had ever heard of. I mean, he totally out of nowhere, this phenomenon. So, but the best moment of the campaign, we had these primaries, very interesting. It's a very liberal party in 76, and he was a moderate, basically. And then you had the Scoop Jacksons, and we always managed to move in different people. The other key thing we had was the black vote. And when the day we learned that was when we got snowed out in Massachusetts. Carter had won the Iowa caucus, won New Hampshire. Now, people say, oh, see, that's what happened. They loaded up the system. Well, people forget there was a month between Iowa and New Hampshire, and there was a month between New Hampshire and the Florida primary. These were not jammed like they loaded when they loaded the calendar on purpose to allow front runners to survive, because they kept getting knocked off, and I did a lot of knocking off. But anyway, the thing was that Carter could adapt, and we had a mini crisis in the campaign. But each time along the way, basically what it was a guy who was running about what had happened to America. And in the end, at all times, including the general, every time, and when the issue was Carter and should he be president, and people didn't, and remember, the communications were rudimentary compared to today. There were no such things as cell phones. I mean, the campaigns were ridiculous. There were no such thing as cell phones. There weren't even answering machines. I mean, if you weren't there to answer the phone, you didn't get the message, And, as Scott said, we were at lunch about, you went to a place and you went to found the payphones, you had dimes. That's how you did your campaign. And the television was very rudimentary. It was, and they cut off money early in the campaign. The Supreme Court knocked out the Campaign Finance Reforms Act. In any event, what happened was but one of the things that happened was in Massachusetts, after New Hampshire, we decided we'd try to win Massachusetts on momentum, and it snowed, and we had no organization. Carter finished fourth, and the only thing I remember, he called me that night. Carter didn't like to lose, and he called me up, and all he said is, "What happened?" And I said, "It snowed," and so anyway, he said, "But I said there's one important thing. We carried Roxbury, which is where Massachusetts is not a very large black population, centered pretty much in the Roxbury area of Boston, and this Southern Democrat carried Roxbury, carried black voters, and he would all through the campaign. And the secret of that was very simple. Black voters knew he was authentic. Liberals went nuts. They could not understand. How could they vote for this white Southerner? Must be a racist because he's a Southerner, a peanut farmer. And they're standing looking at him saying, he speaks like us. So the same thing, Clinton phenomenon. He went to churches, he could talk, and he talked, he was a Baptist. And more importantly, they knew that he was not only a governor, he stood up. Remember, he succeeded Lester Maddox, the name with the axe handle, as governor of Georgia. And he stood up, he and his family, in Plains Georgian Church for the integration of their church, the only family. Well, let me tell you something. You did that in the 1960s. You were you had done a lot more about civil rights than any liberal I knew in Boston had ever done, and there was that affinity, and that was part of the secret, is that he could take that vote everywhere, and did. And so those were some of the, it was a very tough campaign, but the biggest moment of all to me, more than election night, which I still there's all of this description to me. It's the one thing about election night is it started with Jimmy Carter and Rosa Carter alone in the suite, and I had the boiler room I was doing to get results down the hall, and I came in. It was just the three of us. By 4 o'clock in the morning, there must have been 1,000 people in that room trying to get in. And I was trying to get in and out, but what was the night of the convention, the closing of the convention, when Daddy King, Martin Luther King Sr., we gave the benediction, and we all stood up on the stage holding hands singing "We Shall Overcome." Blacks, in 1976, we were all from the South, basically, most of the campaign, white and black. And to me, that was the moment I will always remember as the pinnacle of that campaign, as a moment. And that's why we're 33 points ahead. The country was going, this is the healing, this is about solving things. So, but we had someone who was totally untested, and had not been on the national stage at all. So it was that battle.
I'm curious, what was the highest point of the president's 4 years, and what was the lowest point? From your point
the 100-day mark, Carter still has the record. We were at 100 days in, which was the first time Gallup polled. They didn't poll every day in those days, thank God. And Carter had an approval rating in the 70 percentile, close to 80. And was the highest since John Kennedy in 1960. And we had, I think it was like 65% of the Republicans approved, almost all the Democrats and stuff. So that was the high. We had high numbers. He got high numbers. Actually, did not get after the peace treaty when he brokered the peace on the Camp David process with Begin and Sadat. Went up some. That was good. The other big point was the crisis of confidence speech. He took a 15-point jump in one night. That's another whole story. And then when the Iranian hostage crisis, he went back up to again rivaled his first-year numbers, and those fell very quickly after that when the economy and when the hostages didn't come home. So there were really this, but there were a lot of problems all the way through. It was a struggle all the way through. But we didn't get hit with the real problems till really 2 years in the economy. We didn't. Today is a whole different world. Nor do we have real international. Although the reason that the election was so close, understand this, when I said about risk, same reason that it almost upset Reagan. We almost beat Reagan in 80, which I consider the 80 campaign, just so you know. I consider 76 kind of a lark, the magical mystery tour thing. The 80 campaign, I consider our campaign probably one of the greatest presidential efforts in all time, because we had no business even being in the race. And we took it right to the point where, when we had the debate and so forth, it came very close to pulling it out. And it was a very different situation. But the thing was, remember, it was the height of the Cold War. The idea of electing someone who had no experience in foreign policy and had been never on the national scene was an amazing jump when you're putting in that person's hands the nuclear power of the United States. And you have to understand that is what dominated in the end of elections. That's why in post-World War II until the Berlin Wall fell, it's the only reason Bill Clinton ever got elected when the Berlin Wall fell, because every election since then, at the end, the incumbent party, something I learned by studying, it just hit me and found out, and we would see it in 76 and in 84, was in the end of the campaign, if people had not, and this is, let me give it back up a second. Remember in 2004, everyone said, all these experts, all these people had never been in a presidential campaign, John Kerry and Democrats, saying, well, the undecideds, if they're undecided at the end, they're going to break for John Kerry. It means they don't want George Bush. And I'm the lone voice saying, would anyone look at history in times of war, if you're undecided at the end, only at the presidential level? This is not a Senate race. People will break for the incumbent. If the challenger cannot convince people he should be president, then they will go to the incumbent or the incumbent party. That was the history, which happened then and happened, we got to that point, carried Gerald Ford back to almost winning the race. And then we started in 76 on a weekend, the race was down to even. And, you know, I remember sitting there thinking, I remember being really depressed because I think there's a good chance, because by the weekend I'm pretty much done with what I can do. And I'm thinking that it is, I'm about to go down, I might well go down in history as having been part of blowing the biggest lead in the history of American politics and into into ignominy for this. And but I called my mother, just so you know how, when it gets down to it, even if you're doing all the numbers. My mother, for the first time, and when I told her I was helping some guy in Georgia or something at the end of 75, and at Christmas time I was home in Charleston, she said, are you working for that fellow, that Jimmy Carter fellow I saw on TV the other night? I said, yes. She said, oh, she said, he's going to be president. I know, I saw it. She said, I had an insight. He will be president. And, you know, we have mothers, go on. So anyway, it's now the Friday night before the election, Saturday night, and I called, Sunday, the Gallup has actually Ford ahead by a point, statistically in the meeting. And I called my mother, and I was really thinking, oh, this is really low. And she said, so I called my mother. What do you do? I was 26. Told her, you go home, call your mom. It's the end of the world. She said, he's going to win. Didn't I tell you? My mother said, have I ever lied to you? And I said, no. She said, well, I'm telling you he's going to be president. Don't worry about it. And from that moment on, I never worried again. And the moment, it was the most amazing, no set of numbers could have done for me what my mother and her insight about his being president. And I told Carter the story after President Roosevelt cracked up, and he talked to my mother election night, thanked her that she was better at this than her son was, and it was. But Carter and I had a particularly the first time a pollster I think had a relationship with the president the way I did, or someone in the campaign. Yeah,
I want to get through 2 or 3 more questions,
yeah, sure.
And then we'll open it up for questions from our audience. But you guys did a remarkable job in the 80 campaign, holding it together until, like you said, around the time of the debates. And
the thing we should have done.
Then it started opening up fairly dramatically. And at what point did you know that it was lost? And was it you, Pat? Did I remember this correctly? You're the one who told the president what the numbers were like the day before the election.
This is a great story. This is where you get great stories. We had the whole key to the general. We won the primary, beat Kennedy. And then we suffered in New York. The problem is that Kennedy had problems. People were, we knew that if the issue was Jimmy Carter, we would lose. Not only lose, but slaughter. As long as Kennedy was the issue, that was the battle in the primaries. In the general election, it was going to be Reagan. Now, I've read some history books, as I recently spoke at College of Charleston, where I live, and they're having a class about the 80 campaign and debates. So I had to revisit this. And I recall they handed me this textbook. And I got to tell you, it's amazing to read how wrong history is written. Because it says the Carter campaign never took Reagan serious. That's just crazy. We took him dead serious from the beginning. Problem is he was the only Republican we could beat, potentially because of the problem of him, people thinking he might be an extremist in his age. And our whole campaign, we had nothing basically going for us. and we crawled back to even. There was John Anderson, for those of you who are old enough. John Anderson had run in the primaries against Reagan, had lost, and was now running as an independent. The hero of Hollywood, if you will. And so everybody decided we should have a three-way debate, and our position, I didn't want a debate. I knew one thing from the debates in '76. What people knew when we started, there had not been presidential debates except in 1960. The myth was that Jack Kennedy won this big victory in the debates, and that's what everyone thought, and that's how he got to be president. Well, we went back and looked, and that was totally untrue. The numbers between going into the first debate and coming out didn't move the race in that election 2 points. But what it did by the end of, remember they had 4 debates. The process of what it did, and so what you always do is it's sort of the grabbing on to things afterwards to help explain phenomena. The truth is, what I learned was when we did the research, and Sam Popkin, John Gorman, and I were doing intense work on the debates after 4 challenges, was that what it did was Kennedy won for one reason, never because at the height of the Cold War, and his inexperience, remember he was the youngest man then to run for president, was that, and plus being Catholic, that was another issue. But the simple question was, the debates answered the question for which he himself said he would have lost. Did he pass the threshold? The issue wasn't was he ever as experienced or qualified as Nixon. The question was, did he pass the threshold where people felt that he could handle the presidency? That is what was important. And in 1976, that is what it did for Jimmy Carter. So in 1980, the one thing I was determined we were not going to do is debate a movie actor who was as skilled on the podium as anybody I'd ever seen. So we announced, Reagan said he would only debate with Anderson, and the president said our position was we would not have a debate with 2 Republicans. Now, our problem had been that we didn't debate Teddy Kennedy in the primary. And we got a lot of flack for that. It was a terrible strategic mistake. And at one point, the president wanted to debate, interestingly, all of his political advisors, except for the vice president, but all the people that helped get him elected in '76, to a person was desperate for him to debate Kennedy. I mean, we were gamblers. We knew what politics was. And the argument was, no, you're president. So anyway, so we don't debate. So everyone thinks we stayed in the Rose Garden all spring, and all the stuff with the hostages goes on. And so remember, we had double-digit unemployment, double-digit interest rates, and the hostages, we've had a failed rescue mission, and the hostages are still sitting after a year in Tehran. This is not the best formula for running a campaign. It made what McCain faced, and our numbers were almost as bad as George Bush's. And we were running for re-election. So the point was, though, is that Reagan was a real risk. We managed to make that the campaign. I said we cannot debate. I said whatever we do, and if we debate, we cannot debate at the end. We should do nothing, and it's in writing. I mean, it's not anything I'm making up. We cannot debate. We will lose the debate. There's no question. We appear on a podium. I don't care who says what the public says who won. We will lose. We will lose because we will give Reagan the opportunity to answer for him the most risky candidate probably in modern history in voters' eyes at that point. A chance to reassure people, and anybody who's watched him on a podium knows he'll pull that off. And now I didn't know they would end up with our debate book too, which is our debate prep book, which is another whole story. If I'd known that, we wouldn't have gone. But because everything was based on how to deal with that, engage. What happened was we were going to call off. He kept insisting on having Anderson. He debated Anderson alone in September. It took us a month to bring him back down from that event, even though people thought Anderson won, but it did for Reagan. The day we were going to call off the thing, we were just going to say, okay, it's too late, he wouldn't agree to have a debate, is the same day their poll showed, even though Dick Wirthlin says that's not the case. Knopfsinger told me, Lynn Knopfsinger, I got to like a great deal, told me he said, let me tell you, we did it because we had to, it was slipping away. The incumbent movement was moving, it was all headed. We were ahead, for the first time in the general election, we were ahead going into that debate in Cleveland. Problem was, people think, oh, he won it when he got up and said, there you go again, Mr. President, or basically it's written, are you better off at the end, the summation, you're better off than you were 4 years ago. That's just made, that's fantasy. He won the debate from the minute we opened the thing, when he did not crumble. And all he had to do was, we were trying to make him make a mistake, and he didn't. And then, by the way, in the closing, both Wirthlin and I, the same guy invented technology. We didn't know this. Wirthlin was Reagan's pollster, was selling the technology to both of us the same night. Telling neither one of us that he was doing this. And Carter won the closing, which is funny. There you go again. Better off than you were 4 years ago. The truth of the matter was, that moment, the race went from us being slightly ahead, and we would start slipping behind. We went down about 5 points. Then on Saturday, we went back to even. We were down 5 points on Friday night. We were even on Saturday, started to come back, and then on Sunday. Sunday was the day prior to the anniversary of the taking of the hostages. And on Sunday, we went down 5. And on Monday night, we went down to 10, which is exact margin. It's the first time a presidential campaign had ever gone in close at the end, at the beginning of the weekend, at the end, and come out a landslide. This is the anomaly. It wasn't always going to be a Reagan landslide. What happened was Carter stuff. Once Reagan proved that people thought he could be president, the issue became, my God, why are we going to keep him? And the answer was answered the day of the hostage thing. Oh yeah, boy. That's what triggered Sunday. But more importantly, it wasn't the hostages they were voting against. It was the hostages remind people, particularly blue-collar Democrats, what they were really angry about was the economy. And basically, it dropped. And I had to tell, so Sunday, Saturday, Monday night, we're in the White House. I get the numbers. And I've got a terrible feeling because I've seen Sunday's numbers. The numbers come in, it's about 9:30 in the East Coast. I get the numbers in my office, and I had flown to Boston. I'd forgotten to vote. So I flew to Boston to vote illegally, absentee, just because I needed to do something. So I went up there and flew back from Boston and arrived in my office. Walked in, and there were no lights on. Everybody in my staff was sitting in the dark. So I knew it was over. They showed me the numbers, and it was what I thought it would be, 10. And so I called. Now, I went through all the stuff 3 times. We went through it. And then the president and the campaign, Jody, and all of them are out on the West Coast campaigning with the clock. I called Hamilton, Jordan, and Jerry, and I said, we better get together because it's going to be really bad, and we better think about what we're going to do about trying to save. I said, we better worry about whether we can save the Congress. And so we went to the White House. We met about 10:30 in Hamilton. And just the 3 of us, just the guards and us in the West Wing. Very eerie scene, if you could think of this. 3 of us sitting there, and they're saying, are you really sure? And I said, this is really over. So the key is, how are we going to tell the president? So we all decided that Jody was with him. So Jody should tell him. So we get Jody on the phone. Now I can hear Jody is underneath the podium. And I am telling Jody that it is God. And I can hear the president making his last campaign speech over the phone because I'm right above Jody. And I can hear the thing, and he's giving a great speech. And I'm having to deal with the road shock. Suddenly saying it's gone. And so we said, Jody, so Hamilton's saying, all right, Jody, we figured you should tell him because you're there. They get on the airplane. We wait. Jody puts a call through to me. We're there, and I'm sitting outside. Hamilton's in his office. I'm at his secretary's desk. Jerry is somewhere in the place. And Jody's was checking with us one last time. President Carter gets on the plane, and he sees Jody talking, and he hears Jody talking to me. And he grabs the phone out of Jody Powell's hands and says, it was really up. It would have been a great ending campaign. He said, Patrick, somebody called me, was happy. Patrick. He said, how are we doing? And I'm sitting there, and Jody, suddenly I'm going to give it, so, I said, it's over. I said, we're going to lose badly. It's going to be a landslide. And that's how I got to be the famous story of giving the bad news. It wasn't something I looked forward to doing. We all thought Jody was going to do it. So I had talked to the president, and he never doubted me. The interesting thing about a relationship is, I remember the next day reading the story that Tim, we were getting good reports of turnout or stuff. I never got out of bed till about 6 that day. Press would call, and the exit poll people would call, and they would check, and I'd say, it's about 10 points for Reagan, right? I'd say, yes. They would, how do you know? I said, oh, just believe me, I know. And I went to bed and went back to sleep. I just spent the day sleeping and hiding out until the time to go to the White House. But Rosen was all up with these reports. She went into, and this story is, somebody wrote the story. They were in the presidential bathroom, I guess, the 2nd floor, and Rosen said, well, maybe, she said, she said, these reports are really good, and Jimmy Carter's reported in the story, as he backed up, saying, he said, Pat's never wrong. And she said, and Rosa said, yeah, I know, you're right. I was just hoping. So, this is really great. Never want to be in that position to bring news like that. Get somebody else to do it. Is my story on that.
I am going to count on somebody in the audience to ask a couple West Wing questions.
Yeah, let's get on the
I will do that,
is
but
really,
if
really
you don't
the
ask
best one.
them, but I've run out of time, and I want to just get one
Yeah.
last question in before we
Stu.
turn it over to you guys, and that is, how's the president doing? What's your assessment? We're at, I believe, 92 days.
We're 92 days in.
Yeah.
I think my assessment, it really is a long answer. I think the president personally is doing very well. I think that he has got a problem, and I think it's not dissimilar from President Carter's, which is a big agenda. He's got a much worse time, and he has a problem that he has, in some ways, a government that's not of him. It's a man who campaigned on change, and he has a government filled with inside Washington people. And you can argue about experience or whatever, but there's a real problem with that. I think that the press has hurt him badly by making the environment sound like, and some of the polls have been so badly cooked, in my opinion, to reflect what the press, the New York Times, CBS, what they'd like it to be. And they're being misleading into thinking this is all very good. There has been from the beginning, which started off very high. He's running in any poll of voters, he's going to end up around 55, maybe less, 55, 54. He'll end up higher among all adults. The real truth is that he has had, the Pew poll came out with this polarization problem. The Republicans have already all gone, much worse than the Democrats left George Bush much earlier, George W. Bush. That was after the 2000 election. And there are reasons for that. And independents have started to move. The issue moving is, and it's not helping Republicans. Don't misunderstand. The people are not pleased with Republicans. They are terrified of too much too soon. And if you track what I've been tracking, which is the sense of that this is too ambitious, the fear of what these deficits will do, the fear that the government is going too far. The thing is, the American people, the reaction and the concern that Obama is not being, and this is what I think his problem is. He ran as a candidate of change. He has allowed himself, and I watched this happen. And I was reminded after the session earlier today, I said to someone, Bill Romsey was at the beginning of this conversation with that person in South Carolina, that I wish the moment I most ever wanted to talk to Barack Obama was at that moment, because he needed to understand what happened to Jimmy Carter. And I won't get into all the reasons it also happened, but this thing of doing too much, getting off this track, and the problem of, there are many problems with this, but there are deep concerns in the American people. And I mean deep, and they are legitimate. And yet at the same time, people would like him to succeed. It's not that they like the Republicans, but you already see the evidence. It's a very simple question right now. You know what the economy is going to be in a year, and I'll tell you what it's going to be. And I'm afraid that the problem is that I don't think any of the magic men know the answer to that problem. I think they've proven for weeks, months, they don't know what's going on. And I think the public is saying, they're looking at these deficits, and he's getting into, the president has a problem. You cannot get up one day and announce, I'm going to do something about spending, because they see these numbers, these concerns are polling all the time, which is unprecedented. No, they're not unprecedented. The Clinton White House is the worst. President Clinton wouldn't go to the bathroom without a poll, and almost literally. And then when he didn't like the polls, he fired his pollster and hired another one. Which is unusual, but they do a lot. They do weekly stuff. Obama doesn't particularly care about that stuff very much. I think he has great confidence himself. I think the problem is to face a situation where you have a country, on the one hand, that isn't pleased with its politics, and a political elite that basically is very detached and has been for some time from the people. And I think the president got elected because there was a feeling that he would make the elite understand the country. And I think the problem he's having is of whether or not that connection is still viable. And I think it is slipping. And I think the worst thing is let me tell you about politics. I learned this from Jimmy Carter. I remember Richard Nixon, Bill Clinton, they didn't have a problem. People knew what they were getting. They didn't have any doubts. People aren't. But when you invest in people a certain special hope, which is what there was in Jimmy Carter, and what there is with Obama, who himself in his autobiography speaks of that, about people project onto me what they wish or hoping for. He understands that phenomenon. The problem is that disappointing people is a far graver political burden to carry eventually than having already been what people thought and proving it, which is the Clinton-Nixon example. I would say that they thought Nixon was very competent, they didn't like him a lot, and they didn't think he was particularly on the up and up. And they had no idea of Watergate, but they thought he knew what he was doing. The Democrats had really screwed Vietnam up, and inflation, and Clinton after Bush won. And I think that I say this with some pain, but I say it with some conviction. And I think the Democratic Congress is taking the president down. Somebody's going over the cliff. This 53%. Remember, he won an election with the first time we have ever had an economy blow up in the middle of the campaign itself in September. He was running about even with McCain at that moment, Obama was. You had a president whose ratings were actually much worse than Jimmy Carter's. You had the disappointment with all these things in the economy, and the out-party benefits on the economy enormously, and people were tired of Bush, but I thought Bush had basically, in the public mind, had disappeared. And then you had this crisis, and I thought the way McCain handled whatever. Point was, it went to 6 points right after the bailout of the problem with the banks and never moved. Well, with those 6 points, remember, was 53. This was not an endorsement. And this is why I'm surprised at the president. Surprised at the stimulus, that he didn't go in there and narrow it and win 80% of the votes from the Congress, because the Republicans were desperate. They were dead. They were willing to do whatever reasonable he wanted. But when he turned that over to Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi, it was one of the greatest strategic mistakes in history. I think this decision to sign the earmark bill, after David Axelrod apparently urged him not to veto it, and I said this afternoon he never would have had to veto it. All he had to do was threaten, and every earmark would have been out there. But that would have been a moment to us, because the Republicans were compromising themselves so much for fiscal responsibility, right? Hand in hand with the Democrats. And my point is that that was a moment to test the issue of change. The thing is the numbers moving on going too far have already moved. And you can keep doing what some of these polls are doing, which is writing questions to get the answers you want. But anybody who's looking at the stuff that's serious, that I consider serious and thoughtful stuff, is seeing this huge disquiet growing, which is, what are my children and grandchildren going to face? And this idea that we were elected, the Democrats were elected, to produce, a revolution of all the things we ever going to have, and think you're going to put this over on the American people. And the press and the reaction, the Tea Parties are very significant, and they are not to be discounted. Those were generated pretty much locally. Republicans kept trying to attach themselves to it. People didn't want them, and one of the people in my state, not out in South Carolina, got booed off the stage for voting for the stimulus, but voting not for the stimulus, but for the bailout. They showed the tarp. But I'm just saying, I think that if I were there, based on history, I would argue a whole different picture than the president's being told, and they're convincing themselves. And I want to tell you, he continues to elect Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid to find what we're going to do. And the Republicans are going to do extraordinarily well, not because anyone's voting for them, because they're going to throw a monkey wrench. But more importantly, the public has had it with all of them. The thing was, Democrats were going to have to win an election. People kept saying, well, we'll elect the Democrats, that's going to make a difference. If that does not happen with this economy and what's going on, then it will not be simply, oh, the Republicans will win. I guarantee you there will be something very different coming. That is a long answer to the very hard question, but that's how I read it.
Fair enough. We're going to open up to questions now.
Hollywood's much more fun.
Ryan has a mic so that everybody can hear your question, and so that we can also get it on our video.
I've noticed that Dick Cheney has been on TV a lot lately. Why? I mean, usually don't vice presidents just kind of fade into the sunset, and then you have to try to remember who the vice president was?
Yeah, well, I think that he is. Cheney was a unique vice president. I don't say that necessarily fondly. He's not my favorite person. But the problem is that he said some very tough things. They've said some very tough things said about him. And let me tell you something. This man is never going to run again. I mean, he thinks that, he's got very strong views. And the answer is, since nobody else, the problem with the Republicans is they have no one to speak for them, or anyone you would recognize that you want to hear from. Certainly no one wants to hear from George Bush. And I mean, the reason the Republican Party is in the trouble it's in is because Republicans deserted it. There was not a massive movement of revolution of sudden Democrats appearing out of Mars and arriving on Earth. It was Republicans deserting the Republican Party starting in 2006 over the issues of spending and corruption. The issues that are threatening the Democratic Party today are overspending and corruption. And the Republicans have nothing to suggest that they are anything but, get us back and we'll serve the same interests, which is another part of the problem, which is Wall Street. And I don't want to get into that. I didn't spend too much time this afternoon on that. But Cheney is there, and he is going to he's going to say some things. And of course, he's not a very popular former vice president. The problem is he will be heard. And the problem, I'm sure, that's frustrating him is he's watching foreign policy, and President Obama, people are not paying a bit of attention to what's happening overseas. And the president is lucky on that. Because I think I've seen moments of that, and some of it I agree with, and others I've been in this movie before, myself, and I wouldn't do certain things. But in any event, it's not yet important unless something happens. But the Cheney's doing what he does, and I mean, he's probably the least popular retiring vice president. But he ain't running for anything. This isn't like Walter Mondale running. It's a guy who has his own convictions. He was a very powerful force, and he's going to say very tough things. That's why he's in the media. How can you not cover it when the former vice president says the president is putting the country at risk, and says it doesn't just throw it out there, but whether you believe it or agree with it, says what his positions are on. That's going to get coverage, and it's going to hang out there, even if people may not like him, but that's a message that I'm sure the Obama people wish would go away.
Okay. Other questions? Right here.
Thank you for being here tonight. It seems to me that the protests represented through the Tea Parties came very early in this administration. Could you tell me, do they have significance, and why did they happen as soon as they did?
Well, they're very important, and not just the Tea Parties. Another event that got no coverage was that from the left, well, if you want to call it the left, I actually think these people are on the same boat. People we would think of as more liberal were out rallying on the 11th in about 80 cities against the banks and the bank bailouts and the continuation of Wall Street's dominance of American politics. People who are, there are a lot of people like myself who find it disquieting that my party's took 57% of the money from Wall Street and the financial community, and that most of the leadership basically has served them as well as any Republican ever did in terms of those folks and whatever they say. But in any event, let me tell you why it's significant. First of all, no one's ever seen. The only kind of protests like that I can remember were about wars. And those were much better, or those were much more centrally organized. These protests are a function of something called the internet. They are people who believe the media, who makes a terrible mistake of treating them with such contempt. This notion that we will turn them into Republican, that they're Republican robots. These were basically local people doing local organization, and the issue driving me is not taxes, it's spending. It is a fear that something bad, and also their anger about the bailouts that happened, and I watched Republicans being booed, and the thing is what's important is there were a lot of people, and they were in a lot of different places, and they happened because people put something on the internet or got in touch. These new methods of communication that do not require the media to seed them. But people don't come out 93 days into a presidency. And it wasn't about Obama alone. It was about a fear of what's happened. If anything, the mood in those crowds, from what I saw, was a lot of it was they should all go. It was about what has happened. It was a fear about the future. It is just as the anti-bank stuff. People who believe that they are not heard, and they elected Obama because the reason that people were so positive to him in the beginning, even those who didn't vote for him, the belief that he would somehow, this whole presidency hangs on the crux that he was going to be different about Washington. And he keeps doing this stuff of being of endorsing Chris Dodd yesterday. Not just saying, I got to be for him because he's chairman of the banking committee, but embracing him that he's a wonderful statesman, and the people of Connecticut, when people get this, Chris Dodd's an old friend of mine. We used to go drinking and stuff. I mean, we were old buddies. But I want to tell you something. He's as close to being gone from a position of power as anybody I've ever seen. This stuff is unacceptable to people, all the stuff with Colin, the entire culture of corruption that surrounds Washington, and the press's willingness to ignore it. And when you talk about polls, I mean, I said today, one of the most significant numbers, and it was true 2 years ago, and it's true today, and it's the only poll, Rasmussen's the only person that bothers to ask people how strongly they feel about, think the issue, different issues are. And number one is the economy. For up until the middle of last year, it was the war. Number two is by far only 6 points behind in terms of the numbers. Say it's very important. 81%. Corruption, ethics, and government ethics and corruption. Taxes are high. They're in the 60s. Health care is below that. Immigration is another one that's been rising since the fall. A very dangerous issue. And what he's proving is the political elite refuses to recognize. No other polls ask, but it's not allowed to be recognized an issue. People know something terrible is going on there, and it has to do, and it is. And I'm just saying, these things should have been a warning. The press to be as content. The mood I took away watching a lot of the press coverage of the mainstream media, and of course Fox was promoting them, that's another matter, but was the idea of who are these yahoos. It was the same reaction after the AIG firestorm. When they went out, when I thought the leadership of our Congress was so distinguished, they go out with half the Republicans voting for a retroactive tax after something they had put on in the bill, a bill they had not read. That's the American people's response. They didn't read the bill that gave them this bonus. They're always being taken care of that way. And it's interesting, the public's not in favor of retroactive. They were angry about these bonuses. They're really going to be much more angry when they find out there's $180 billion their money is going to take care of the Wall Street banks at 100%, but on the dollar, that were AIG counterparties. But more importantly, it is, this notion, they said Newsweek had a cover, which I brought it with me on the trip, I didn't bring it here, that they had right after the AIG thing. It was a picture in Newsweek, and it said, Thinking Man's Guide to the Populist Revolt. And it was a picture from the movie Frankenstein, the 1930s, of the crowd with the torches and the whips and the pitchforks, driving Frankenstein over the cliff. I'm going, whoa! This is their view. That's how they think of these people who have the nerve. Who do they think they are? They're the owners of the country. And when somebody gets up and says, I'm not going to tell you to vote, somebody is not a Republican, somebody gets up and starts saying that, and that's what they're saying. And challenges, the issue in this country is not whether someone's a Democrat or Republican. And I gave an outline. I believe what is waiting, there's going to be an explosion. If anyone offers the people a place to stand that says, we don't speak Democrat and Republican, we speak American here. And the issue is whether you believe that the country is an exceptional country, that the children's future is something more than something of a slogan, but a moral obligation. And people who believe that you should be told the truth, and that the government should not be, the whole system should not be rotten by money. And lastly, we believe that they should do something. They have a responsibility. That is what their tradition is. That is who they are. And tied up with a neat string called common sense. Common sense. You want to see, we're headed for, I think, a different kind of politics. And the Republicans may benefit in the short term because they'll have candidates and then people may vote for them to put a monkey wrench into this. Democrats are on the verge of heading off a cliff. They have no clue is coming. But the arrogance is what scares me. People should have taken this very seriously. And I said today the same point I made at the end of this afternoon. When Barack Obama told the bankers, I'm the only thing standing between you and the pitchforks. I got news from my friend David Axelrod and others who were there making fun of, talking about the Tea Parties as a bunch of racists and crazies, and people get out of hand, and people who protest are nuts. I mean, let me just say, the Joe the Plumber thing. I don't care if he's an idiot. In this country, you have a right to get up and ask a presidential candidate and say you don't agree with them. To have the entire apparatus of the national press, to have an entire political government of a state turn on someone for challenging a presidential candidate is dangerous. You start doing that with everybody. You know, he has a right to be a fool if he wishes. He has a right to speak. And I'm going to tell you something. They keep this up. You start saying this to people, and I'll tell you who's between them. These people who are willing to have a peaceful protest to be heard, they're the people standing between Washington and the pitchforks. And you marginalize them and you'll get a whole different kind of reaction. And I think somebody, and I'm going to try to write an article about, because this is a moment of truth here. And it was beyond belief what I saw. Someone must want to ask about Hollywood. That is so much more fun.
That's exactly what I was going to ask.
Good.
I'd certainly like to hear your favorite moment from working with The West Wing. We heard some great stories tonight, and I'm sure there's some.
Oh, there are many. And first of all, you have to understand what fun it was. We did this series. Everyone said it would fail. NBC, despite the rumors, stories about how proud they were, they didn't want to put it on the air. The people who took over NBC were begging the producer, John Wells, they'd give him another extra show if he wouldn't agree to, he agreed just to drop the idea. And they were sort of contractually obligated. And we went on the air, and it was a lot of fun, and I had a lot to do with the first couple of seasons. And it was, there were some, well, I guess one of my greatest moments was, I had been of the belief, and Aaron, there are two stories I'll tell to get back to politics. One's a good one about Republicans, one's not so pretty. But anyway, but they make a point. Our point was, my point to Aaron, and I went to have lunch with him. I'd met him in another movie. We were very friendly, but I had no intention of working on it. And I went to him and I said, but I had another show, which I'm working, developing now still. And I just talked to him and I said, you know, this is really important that this not fail. Because every time Hollywood touches politics, they screw it up. And it fails. I said, the reason I've thought a lot about this, it's two reasons. One is, and I'd learned a lot from doing In Line of Fire, which was the first thing I worked on, and I was in that and some other political films, which was, but I had a belief set in those things, which were, number one, the thing about politics is Hollywood gets it wrong because they always make it so unreal. It's everyone in Hollywood, if they make a crime movie or a movie about, cops or doctors, to me, that stuff is just real. You know it's real when you see it. They make fantasy about politics, but what they think it's like without asking anyone. So my point was, first of all, it has to be real. People know automatically. They don't have to be they just know when something's authentic or not. And I learned that on the movie On the Line of Fire because Wolfgang Petersen, the great German director, who I was a good friend and a man I just admired greatly, when they were interviewing me about being the consultant on the Line of Fire, and I was a big fan of the movie Das Boot, for any of you who've ever seen the movie about the submarine, German submarine. And I said, it's about sausages. And he looked at me and said, sausages? And in American submarine World War II movies, everything looks like this room. It's all clean, big, and everything is in place. In Das Boot, the sausages are hanging from the ceiling, food. And as soon as I saw it, I didn't know it, but I knew it was true. And obviously, these submarines, you didn't have a lot of space. You're going for this long cruise. You put as much food as you could everywhere. That was my point. To me, I knew it was real when I saw it. I never read it, but it was real. So my point about politics, Aaron, was, look, it has to be real. Second thing is this thing about making presidents crooks and cynics and making cynical politics. People are tired of being cynical about politics. They're not going to want to pay money or spend a night every week being reminded how much they hate politics. This should be a place, as I said to him, it's important to be real and to be idealistic. The idea should be that the show should say to people every once a week, this is what I could go to and this is what I wish my government was about. And I said, in that case, which Aaron felt strongly, it shouldn't be, even though Bartlett was going to be a Democrat, if you notice the difference between the first seasons and at the end, when he was gone, I was gone, is that it became a left-wing polemic. Basically, the pressure of lecture the people. But the instance, my two best stories about it, other than the show itself, was I got a call in the first season. This is fall of 2000. The campaign is going on. I get a call from somebody in Austin from the Bush campaign. They're calling up and something, and they're telling me in the course of this conversation, and I was doing a lot of commentary too at the time, and in the course of the conversation, the person says, down here, he said, the person said, at 8 o'clock Central Time, 8 o'clock every Wednesday night, we shut down for an hour, and the entire campaign watches West Wing. And I said, we have done something. This is what we set out to do. And the second thing was, and the different thing was, when Tom Dole, one of my real heroes, speaking of somebody who really should have been, if you're going to hang somebody in effigy for what, if you're a Republican, what was done to your party, that's the man you should meet. One of the nastiest people I've ever known in politics. I was once on TV, and he made some attack on Democrats, State of the Union when they were in the majority. And, it's the Democratic commentators, I was on MSNBC, and they were all saying, well, oh, God, what terrible. I just said, look, Tom Dole, I said, there are moments when I try to remember why I'm a Democrat. And every time I do, Tom Dole comes out and says something that reminds me why I'm a Democrat. But anyway, he attacked West Wing as a godless, terrible show down at the press club. So the first time we'd been attacked by somebody, West Wing, the show wouldn't let me respond. And I said, this is what I do really good at. Let me defend the show. This time they let me. And I went on the air and I said he was on before me. He was on with me, actually, on Chris Matthews. And I said, let me ask the congressman something other than the fact that he obviously has never seen the show. We have a president who has first of all, we have a show that has no violence, no gratuitous sex, in which 2 weeks ago the President of the United States got down on his knees and begged God for forgiveness, having executed someone. And where the president, and I said, the person who writes the thing, Aaron, is a patriot. Now, exactly what is your problem with the show? Which, by the way, he then confessed he'd never seen. It just tells you everything about Tom Dole. And my point was, Aaron Sorrell, I knew Aaron Sorrell was the patriot. And that show was about, and that's why so many people liked it. It still went over, as I said, it killed itself eventually, but because of the pressures to make it, we're going to show the. But I think at the beginning, and we had some fun. First thing I remember was the first time we got about 4 weeks into it when we hit the top 10, the ratings, and we suddenly realized we were going to survive. I only had a 6-week, because it's a long story. I had originally a 6-week contract, and and my point was if I could figure out how to make myself useful in 6 weeks, I didn't belong there anyway. And so anyway, but the bout coincided with our ratings and stuff. So there were so many great moments for me where first of all, working with Aaron, who's a genius, and all geniuses are crazy, and I loved him dearly, and I still do. And the cast, who I haven't managed to have close friendships with all of them, and I was kind of an odd guy there. They originally wanted me to be a starting writer, and I had to explain the studio did, and then I had no intention of starting as a beginning writer. I thought that that didn't quite fit what I should be. So anyway, but the point was with them, and that was an honor, and it was. I learned so much. But then let me tell you the other thing about Hollywood. I just want to say this is the most important thing I learned about Hollywood. I had a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun. The Line of Fire. I got to be in it. I got a great review for my 30-second STEM wiring recording in the Sunday New York Times. And I got to do why they really picked up on why that was so politically why it looked so good, and it gave me an unfair but welcome amount of credit. And Air Force One, where I wrote the beginning. There are all kinds of weird things in these movies. We had the movie in Air Force One. I got to write the whole problem with that was to make, for those of you who saw Harrison Ford in that, it was a pretty big movie, was that we had to make people care about Harrison Ford, that you didn't want him to be dead or down there. So I said the first thing is, the problem with the script was you have to relate, you've got to give people a stake in him. So if you remember the beginning of the speech, he speaks in Russian about visiting the camps and about this genocide that had gone on and stuff, and it makes him into a figure of the first few minutes we really built him up to a guy you would also hope was president, and so that you have some stakes. But anyway, that was all great fun, and I made a lot of friends in Clint Eastwood and things, and you get to spend those long hours with people. And Fred Thompson and I got to be close, good friends. He was on The Line of Fire. He played the chief of staff, and talk politics. But I always said about Hollywood, I left politics because I was just one step ahead of the crowd on the Newsweek cover. And I mean, I had already gone to Santa Barbara. I had been at this very early, and I wanted out very badly. And I didn't like what was happening to me or to politics, a lot of which I helped contribute to, which was a terrible, which no one is, believe me, no one in this process gets off without some, I didn't mean to do some things. I didn't mean for them to turn out the way they did. But you should take responsibility and realize that when you're wrong. But when I went to California, it was to get away from politics. And one thing I found is I loved Hollywood, and people said, what is the difference? The question I always got is, what is the difference between being in politics and being in Hollywood? I said, it's wonderful. I said, in Hollywood, it's like being on methadone. I said, the stakes are so low. It's about money. And you get to have all this fun making things up. And I said, everybody in Hollywood, the difference between politics is, in Hollywood, they look at you and say, let me clean that up. I'm going to screw you. Everyone says that right out front. It's never hidden. You understand that's the agenda. In politics, people have their arms around you while they're putting a knife in your back. And I said, this is wonderful. You're not curing cancer or doing anything else. The stakes are not nuclear war. It's just a question of how much money and who gets it. And therefore, so I loved Hollywood because it's a nice place to do things. Plus, it's a good place, as I said, I'm doing some things where sometimes you get a chance to say something and people react to it. We'll see. But I found it in the last years. I've had a lot more fun than being in politics was. We will see.
We have time for one more question. I think a student, right back there.
I want to echo the previous thanks for your presence here tonight. It's been a great event. And unfortunately, I feel the need to return to politics.
Well, that's all right. I've been there.
The early 1970s saw the rise of the religious right as a powerful movement, and for the next 25 years, they stayed there. And President Carter's written about that in at least one of his memoirs, and there were West Wing episodes about that, and so we'll keep that involved. And as a pollster who was there at the beginning, so to speak, I wonder what that movement looked like in the early and mid-1970s, and how aware you were of it, and what the signs were.
Well, when it first came, first of all, it doesn't really hit until about late 70s, early 80s as a political movement. Moral majority, if you will, comes out. Carter was very much advantaged by evangelicals as a Democrat. Carter's Southern Baptism, which would cost us several states, including, this you have to remember, when I talk about culture, in 1976, just as 1960, most younger people cannot imagine how non-homogeneous America. You think America's different, places different, red and blue states. This was a place where their whole regions were different. Carter would lose California because he would lose San Francisco Bay Area to Gerald Ford because they were frightened of him being a Baptist, okay? He would win Ohio. He would come close to winning about the several states which were very Republican. There were about 8 states we came within 1.5 points of winning because he was an evangelical. Things were very different. A lot of religion played a big impact. It cost us, we came out of Cleveland, Ohio. Ohio was a decisive state. We came out of Cleveland barely 50,000 votes up. And we ran in southeast Ohio, even with Franklin Roosevelt in 1944, all right? So, and that was because it was Southern. The Civil War, Missouri, go across here, look at this state, look at Missouri. You want to see where you could follow the Civil War voting patterns in a lot of the country. Well, the evangelicals partly were, their first reaction to was the disruption of Watergate, Vietnam, student protests, the whole thing was a shaking of the system. Now, the politicalization of when I never had the problem, I'm a Southern Catholic, which is Irish Catholic, which is like being, it's like next to blacks. Jews were exotic. No one ever knew anywhere I was from. So that wasn't anything. But on the list of the Klan's list, Catholics were very high, right behind the blacks, for problems. So that's why, by the way, Catholics in the South were always the most liberal voters next to blacks and Jews in the South, unlike the North. I mean, because they're a minority group, they were. But in any event, the thing was for a long time. But the thing is that I'd lived it, I'd seen it. Evangelicals are very strong people. They are not dangerous. Jimmy Carter wasn't dangerous, although he did make a mistake the day he said that we thought we'd solve the problem. He gave the interview with Playboy, where he talked about lusting in his heart, which was a way to try to tell people. It was, boy, did we think we were genius. Talking about dumb. We thought, well, how smart we are. We're going to do this. We will reach all these people, and we're worried about religion, and he'll explain that he, too, is a sinner. Well, his language was different. The lust in your heart. We almost lost the presidency over that statement because women just were shaking. I mean, going, what is this guy? Lust in his heart, Imperium, Playboy. And we didn't solve that till the last debate. The major part of the folks' last debate was how we were going to deal with the Playboy interview, because that's how concerned being different was. Well, you know, evangelicals, I said all along, this is a misuse. Evangelicals are basically historically non-political. They were being mobilized by fear of what is happening in this society. Then they were being manipulated by people who are, I would say, whose religious intensity, fervor was not as great as their political desire for power. And by the way, that's not new. I can show you ethnic cities. I can show you Catholics doing the same thing. But and by the way, it's not the evangelical change. They just became less they got out of that. Partly there is concern about gay marriage, other issues. But those are the people, and I kept saying this about the Republicans. They better pay attention to their base. These people are not right-wing nuts. These are people who care. They do more work overseas on missions and helping people than anybody I know. Their belief, concern about the environment, about things like that are very great. A lot of them are Baptists who are very relatively populist. And the problem with the theory of the Republican Party, and I said this in 2000 and 2004, it is built on a fault line. The fault line is it is winning many, quote, social conservatives. Those social conservatives were also tended to be very instinctively populist. They were, when the Republicans continued to reward their constituency of Wall Street and big companies, that never went over with those people. And all you need was a bad economic time to see that. I mean, I said you can't take the votes from all these people and then screw them on behalf of a handful of people, which is, you know, I mean, whether you agree with me or not, that's perception. I think there's some legitimacy to it. I never have worried about it. They have just dissipated because they figured it out. Also, their agenda is much broader. That is not to say they are not a force. It is not to say, but people are not to be so easily manipulated. Remember, for most of our history, very strong evangelical movements shied away from politics, particularly after the Civil War, like the plague. And they did not. It was the fear about changing some basic values not being addressed, and concerns that we were, particularly the social changes, and an anger about the fact that this cavalier thing, the abortion thing, cannot be underestimated. Let me just say one thing about it so you understand. The Roe versus Wade is decided in 1973. Do you know that abortion was not an issue in the 1976 campaign? It was not a factor whatsoever. You know why? Because no one yet knew what it meant. Well, let me tell you when abortion became an issue. It was politicized. It was politicized. Ronald Reagan had signed the most liberal state law on abortion as governor of California. When they started putting up things and they started advertising abortion as birth control on billboards and radios and stuff, do this and get pregnant, come and get an abortion. What happened was suddenly that thing and the amount and the numbers started. That issue then became a very hot political issue. It was a reaction to that. The country's always had a very interesting and complex, and do not underestimate the aggregate intelligence and sophistication of the American people. And my one lesson as a pollster I had always, and the thing that I think it made me, and which even today animates me, because I started in high school going door to door, and the first time I did a poll, I'm talking to people, and I think I'm really know everything about politics, and I got my rear end handed to me the first time I asked somebody. I came up with a scale question about Vietnam, whether zero was get out, and 100 was to all out winning, including nuclear war. And all of a sudden, most of the people I'm interviewing, these blue-collar voters, are saying, well, I'm either a 0 or a 10. In other words, either win or get out. That was no option that you ever saw in a poll. When people are saying back to me, and by the way, if you think about it, it made a lot of sense. Also, in the time, all the number of people I met early, this is 67, who told me that they hadn't decided yet, a lot of blue-collar voters, this is even in the South, that they were either for George Wallace or Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy was my political hero. I never thought that existed. And then when I probed people about it, they talked about the fact people fought for underdogs, who were, people thought would fight for them. And I learned, so I learned to have a great respect. Never done a poll that I was not surprised. Did not allow myself to be, taught a lesson. And listen, the American people broke my heart many times. But I always understood the rationale and why. I never questioned those things, even if I thought they were wrong. And the point is that people thought about abortion, they thought, for a long time, for decades, country's attitudes have never changed, the majority. A majority of people think that it's like murder, and a majority of people think that the government shouldn't be deciding this. They don't like it. They don't want it to happen. On the other hand, they understand there are realities in life. And most of all, people believe it ought not to be in politics. It got into politics because it became excessive in people's eyes. And there is a certain reality to that. This effort, however, to take people and brand them, and the people who are manipulating deserve to be branded, but to brand people who have as many views as evangelicals do, as some sort of right-wing religious nuts, or the people I knew in Hollywood who are terrified that somehow they were people going to send the Jews to the ovens, is just a terrible, terrible thing. And politicians and media people play those images. And what the thing is that what we forget, and I think one of the most important lessons that comes out of this to me was, the people in this country are basically good people. What makes Americans unique is that it's a country where people really have always wanted to do basically a democracy in the belief that they will do the right thing. I've always believed that if they're given the information, they will generally do the right thing. Unfortunately, we don't think of our people that way. There's a long answer, and it allowed me to touch some other points, but we should never, that was not anything to worry about any more than it is even though I may disagree with them about gay marriage, a lot of gays that I know if I was giving this talk here, Kansas, Midwest, the South, a lot of my gay friends in California, although they're very emotional about gay marriage, are just as good Americans as anybody else. And we are a very tolerant country. And when we are, there's a certain unity. When you're not, you play with fire. And let me tell you something. The country is, my fundamental belief about politics and all in this, is America's about an idea. Teddy White, after Watergate, wrote about it, was the interview talking to me about it. We were close friends. He was trying to figure out Nixon and what happened, and I said, and he wrote, I said, the problem was that, ever since it was just historical to me that from the beginning of time, when man found fire, it came from the sky and they didn't know what it was, they didn't know how to originally make it. So the most powerful position in the tribe was control of the fire. Nobody screwed with the fire, but who got to be in charge of it was the issue. But nobody messed with the fire because fire was life itself. And I said that's where the Nixon people I thought went very wrong, because this whole country is about an idea. If you want to understand, you just look at the Balkans. You break down the notion that we don't have things in common. Or as Robert Kennedy said, that the person I disagree with is my enemy, and therefore someone I must suppress. When you start dividing the country the way I watch people outrageously and with malice on both sides and in the media on different sides do in describing the American people, we ever lose the idea that we are a special people who have struggled mightily to try to achieve something we are far from achieving. And I will tell you this, we ever break up on the things that divide us, because everything in this country divides us, race, religion, place of origin, all of these things. This is the only society in the world held together by an idea. And the expression of that idea is our political system. And if you corrupt that, you will kill the country. And what I say to people is, do not underestimate this notion that what I believe is the tribal religion of America, which was the year before the founders, the revolutionary leaders, before they declared independence, almost a year to the date, they issued something which almost no one has read. It was called the Declaration of the Necessity of Taking Up Arms. And Jefferson and Dickinson wrote it. And nobody was talking about independence yet. This is July 2nd, 1775. And they said their purpose was that they could not stand the infamy that would be assigned them, were they to deprive their heirs, their children, of their rightful heritage as free people. And they explained that they would rather take up arms and die rather than that. And that idea preceded the idea about what a constitutional government was. It was the idea that in America you give your children better than you have. To endanger that in the face of what we're doing and the way it's being done is not, and that's why I'm saying do not underestimate people's fear. Because ultimately that is what makes, that's the tribal religion. Every generation gets to be an American by earning, in my opinion, earning the right to say they're American because they kept that promise. 20 generations of Americans have done that. And, so these things, if we lose this central idea, and that's why I said I think the most powerful moment in America, and Obama had this for a moment, and I think he's given it away, which is the idea of saying we're something more than partisan. There's something bigger, and it's about America. But you can't do that and do certain other things. And the point is, someone's going to get up and say that. I'm not going to speak Democrat, Republican, I'm going to speak American. And 75% of this country is going to react positively to that. And I think that is what we're missing. Because if not, you will tear this place apart. You want us to think the Balkans are bad? You let this country lose its idea. And everybody looks at each other about our differences, and everybody is a potential enemy. And this will not be a pleasant place to live in. So that was a long answer to your question, but I wanted to say that.
Okay, Pat, thank you very much for a terrific evening. We really appreciate it. Thank you. I have to say, this is one of the most